So I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, and thanks for staying from our cloud security discussion. Lenny Zeltser, he is an incident response handler at the Internet Storm Center, so that exposes him to a number of different exploits and threats and attacks that are on the net today. He's an instructor at SANS and leads courses on malicious software, identifying and remediating. And his daytime job is leads the consulting team, the professional services team at Savvis. So without further ado, Lenny.
All right, hi everybody. Oh, thank you. All right, we're done. I remember I was once social engineered to come and watch a play because they posted all these posters around town, and it said, come see this play, it's going to be really good, it's called Hotel Paradise. And so we figured nothing to do this weekend, so we came into a show. And it was a small show, and in the very beginning they said, you know what, we got you in here, and you thought you're going to see a show called Hotel Paradise, but in reality it's going to be a totally different show, and we're calling it Hotel and then the F word. So that was very interesting. It wasn't a very good play because I felt like they tricked me into being there, and I have no idea why they were doing that. So I hope I didn't trick you into being in the session. I want to talk about social engineering attacks that work and that have worked, because it's really an attack vector that is very effective. And those of you who perform penetration testing can probably vouch for the fact that whenever social engineering is in scope of your test, you're usually successful. And it comes to the point where sometimes I advise my clients to not even bother, just assume that it's successful, and let's talk about what happens next. So we know that social engineering works, and it works because social engineers are really good at influencing their victims to take the action that the social engineer wants them to take. And because it's so effective, I thought, well, what can we do to get better at withstanding such attacks? And oftentimes people talk about social engineering in the context of penetration testing. And I wanted to stay away from that because it's easy to disregard any advice that's based on the very controlled social engineering scenarios of penetration testing. For example, you may have heard of an experiment where researchers asked people for their password by giving out candy and pens, and they said, wow, look at this, everybody gave up their password because we were promised to give them candy. Well, that's a very staged experiment, and we don't really know if the password that the researchers got were real passwords. So I thought, all right, let me survey the real world to see what attacks have been disclosed publicly that had an element of social engineering. And we don't have a lot of time to go very deep into any of those attacks, so instead I'm going to survey this landscape at a very high level. And what I want to do is look at these incidents. Many of them you probably have heard of, but maybe you haven't had a chance to look at all of them in one session, because I want to see what patterns can we derive. Can we somehow categorize these various social engineering techniques so that it's easier for us to talk to our users about social engineering threats, and so that it's easier for us to look at our defenses. Because here's my premise. There's often a debate about what's more prevalent and more dangerous. Is it the outsider threat or is it the insider threat? And once you accept the success of social engineering, I think you will recognize that there is really no distinction anymore. If you have an outsider, if they use a social engineering technique, well, then they become an insider. So really, maybe it's not even worth arguing whether insider or outsider threat is more important to us. I've been thinking more and more that insider is just like an outsider is just like an insider, because it takes very little effort for an outsider to become an insider and have access to a lot of information. So I want to survey a bunch of incidents that some of them you've probably heard about. I want to look for patterns. I want to try to categorize them. And this way we can learn something about real-world social engineering attacks and become better at defending against them. And the first category of attacks that I want to talk about are those that really make use of alternative channel of communications. And maybe it's too fancy of a phrase, alternative channel of communications. What does that mean? Well, it means that attackers find that their victims are most susceptible to influence when the attacker engages them on using a different medium than the victim is used to. For example, the first time I really saw how effective this is where some windshields were pasted with a flyer that said, hey, you parked improperly. To see more information about this, please go to this website. And you may have seen this, I think I reported on it about a year and a half ago. So these were the flyers that were pasted on the windshields of cars parked, I think, in South Dakota. And it says, go to horribleparking.com to see more information. Now, if you got a spam message that said, your vehicle was parked improperly, please go to horribleparking.com, you probably would have disregarded it as spam. And so would a lot of people. But when people got this notice in the physical world, outside of the normal channel of communication that they're used to being on guard well, a lot of them went to horribleparking.com and they saw some pictures of improperly parked cars in their very own town. And of course, if they wanted to see the picture of their own vehicle parked improperly, well, guess what? They had to download this media player. And if they downloaded it, then they infected themselves with a fake antivirus tool. So that was just one example that to me really emphasized how vulnerable we are when the attacker's message comes to us in a channel that's alternate from what we're used to seeing and protecting ourselves against. So email, we're all used to being on guard about our email. So here's an attack that begins in the physical world. Here's another example, again, a variation of a phishing scam, but because people are used to recognizing phishing scams that come to them over email, in this case there was a phone-based element to it. And these are not new. They have been spreading for a number of years. At some point people used to call them vishing, but that kind of went out of favor. Now it's just an element of phishing scams, but this one begins with a voice message that arrives into the victim's phone mailbox. And it's a recorded message. It says something like, we wanted to welcome you to our bank. Please call us at this number to confirm that your account is set up properly. Another variation of many such messages is a message that says that we think there's been fraudulent activity in your account and you need to call us. And when you call, you get a message that says that your card has been suspended and please click 1 or press 1 to go to our security department and to talk to them. What's going on here is that, again, the attackers are making use of an alternative channel of communication because people tend to trust phone communications a bit more than they trust their email communications. So, again, a scam that has been very effective. We, at the Internet Storm Center, looked at one server that had WAV files that had these recordings on them. So these are just WAV files where the attacker recorded the real bank's voice system, and then whenever somebody calls the attacker's probably voice over IP number, well, they played these WAV files, and it sounds just like the real thing. And there are toolkits that allow attackers to automate these attacks. It becomes really easy to do because, well, it's easy on the black market to come by hacked Skype accounts that allow you to call people in the real world and to accept messages from people that call you. Just like nowadays, it's probably not too difficult to hire somebody to start handing out flyers, inviting people in a particular town to visit your malicious website. And how expensive would that be? There's plenty of people, plenty of students who are willing to do that at, I don't know, $9 per hour probably. So here's another example. Again, this is something that has been really effective over the last year, and that's the use of USB keys as an infection vector. And many of us have probably heard of a very effective penetration testing technique that involves the pen tester placing their backdoor program on a USB key and then just leaving these USB keys around in the lunchroom of the company that they're trying to target. And people are going to find the USB key and they're going to insert it into their computer because, hey, it's a freebie. It's great to have more storage because, God forbid, we run out of storage. But I wanted to stay away from pen testing. So here's a real-world example where spreading through USB keys has been really effective. And this is an example of a configure worm. And some of you maybe had the misfortune of having to deal with these infections last year in your organizations. Configure worm, yes, it used the USB key as an infection vector because, again, people are used to being more trusting of USB keys. We were very afraid of floppy drives. Remember how you made sure to scan a floppy drive when you used it because maybe it has a boot sector virus? Well, floppies went away. People forgot about that infection vector. So we're back to the modern version of floppy drives is USB keys. So here's one interesting element of social engineering that was within the configure worm, and it created this autorun.inf file in the root of the infected USB drive. And so when the victim inserted that USB drive into their system, what does Windows do? It brings up a pop-up window that says, what do you want to do? And usually you've got two options that most people care about. One option is to run the program that is supposed to run when you insert the key. And another option is safer. That other option is just to browse contents of that USB drive. And look at the autorun.inf file that was on the configure infected USB key. This particular command specifies that the message the victim should be presented with to run the program actually states open file folder to view files. So you see, the victim is presented with this dialog box, and what are the two options? You can open folder to view files, or you can open folder to view files. Both seem pretty safe. And the victim is probably going to pick the first one. But the first one is actually tied to an action that runs the malicious program. So the attackers are getting really creative. There's some psychological factors here. They recognize that most people are going to pay attention to what's listed first, and probably going to click on that one. So that's very interesting. You've got these multiple levels of social engineering built into little things like dialog boxes, and somebody really put a lot of thought into this. Now here's another example of social engineering making use of these alternative channels of communication. And this is a story that appeared in the news, about maybe a month and a half ago. Gawker is a set of sites that are very popular. Gizmodo, anybody likes Gizmodo, right? They have a very popular blog about gadgets. So their sales department that sells advertisement on their blogs got an email from somebody who wanted to place ads on their site. And here's what that email looked like. The person emailed, and he claims to be coming from a well-known media and advertising company. And he said that we want to place ads on your properties, and we want to do that by the end of this month. Anybody who works with sales, they recognize the importance of closing a deal by the end of this month. So the attacker said, the attacker made sure that they're going to get the salesperson's attention. Hey, you can close a deal at the end of this month, and the deal is pretty sizable, $25,000. So that caught the salesperson's attention. And so the attacker engaged them initially via email, but he was also very willing to talk on the phone with them. And that really helped lower the salesperson's guard. And in their interactions with the salesperson that spanned several days, they really got convinced that they're working with a real executive working for a real advertising company. And they got scammed because the ads that they were displaying, they looked like this. They were advertising Suzuki, but this was not a Suzuki-sponsored campaign because the ads were actually infecting visitors to this website with malicious software. So they were serving infected PDF files. And this is incredible because the attacker was willing to invest a lot of effort into targeting these companies, this company Gawker, but they got a high payoff on their investment because they run some very popular sites. What's interesting to me from this attack is that really there was very little indication that the salesperson could have had that they're dealing with a scammer. The email messages came from a domain name that looked very similar to the domain name associated with a legitimate advertising company. The email messages actually spoke the language of the trade, and the person interacting with them on the phone, I mean, they use the lingo that you're expected to use if you are in the advertisement world. There was no accent, there was no sense that the person is trying to scam them, so they fell for this. Why did they fall for this? I think it would have been less likely if the communications of the attacker were limited just to the email messages. But he went to the phone, and people trust somebody who's on the phone. Sometimes when somebody emails me, I naturally feel more comfortable if I maybe meet them at a conference. Well, who knows if they're supposed to be here? I feel more trusting if I actually get a chance to speak to them on the phone. Well, who knows if this is the person's real phone number? So those were some examples of attackers relying on alternative channels of communications to lower our guard and to influence us into taking their actions. And by the way, the attack on Gawker, the same exact attack was used to place ads on other high-profile sites like the New York Times fell for this several months prior. So fascinating how effective scammers are at social engineering us. So another set of techniques that I have seen very effective in the world of social engineering deal with making sure that the message is personally relevant to the victim. I remember reading a blog where the author said, I think it was Seth Godin, and he said, people don't want to receive and read email. Nobody cares about email. They want to receive me-mail. Right? So you're going to read a message if it's about you, if it's relevant to your job, if it's relevant to your family. So attackers recognize that, and they use that as part of their social engineering tactics. So here's some examples. In this case, this was a variant of the whale deck worm, and I thought it was a very clever scheme. You see, what the whale deck worm did is it spanned people, and it said that there was a breaking news that just occurred in their town. There was a bomb that exploded. And they were invited to click on a link, and when they clicked on a link, they got a message like this: powerful explosion burst this morning. They caught the victim's attention. How? Because they used the geolocation database to determine where the victim was coming from, and they customized this link to give the name of the town or of the city from where the victim was browsing. So I was browsing from New York, so they said, oh yeah, this blast occurred in New York. If you were browsing from Oklahoma, that's where it would give you that locale. So the message is personally relevant. Now I'm really interested, and I want to read more about this, but if I want to read more, or rather see a video feed, what I need to do? Download a video player to read more. But they got me hooked because this is personally relevant to me. So that's an effective tactic. How else do you make sure that the message is personally relevant? Well, you spoof the origin of the message to look like it comes from a trusted source. And lately we've seen a rise in email messages that look like they come as confirmations to shipping packages. Well, here's one example. This message looks like it comes from the UPS. And the message comes to you, no, UPS, you're used to receiving mail confirmations from them. You kind of trust that it's a company that has their act together. And the message says that we couldn't deliver a package to you. Now, when somebody tells me that they're trying to deliver a package to me, I want to get the package because I'm curious. Hey, free stuff. I didn't expect anything. I'd like to see what's in it. But guess what? They missed me. I wasn't home. And they're telling me that to get that package that came out of nowhere that I'm really interested in, I got to print this invoice copy and bring it to the UPS office. So if I print it, it's probably going to be a malicious executable or a malicious PDF file, and that's how they got me. There are two things that are going on here that are important for social engineering. One is that it comes from a company from whom I'm used to receiving such messages, even though it's a little bit strange to me to see the name of the company actually spelled out. Nobody calls UPS United Parcel Service of America anymore. But I guess the attacker maybe thought they'd give the added legitimacy to this message by calling it the United Parcel Service of America. I think our next generation probably won't even know what UPS actually stands for. Another message that was interesting is that this is a little bit confusing. Have you ever had to print some invoice to pick up your package? It's a little bit weird, and I find that a lot of effective social engineers, their goal is just to confuse their target. Because if the target is confused, then they might want to click or open a file just to get more information because it's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable state psychologically for me to remain confused, and I want to clear that out. So a lot of the messages that you get sometimes won't quite make sense to you, but that's on purpose. They want to confuse you so that you take their action to clear up that confusion. Another example of personally relevant messages is a victim receiving content that they are expecting to receive. And the attackers are definitely willing to invest time into profiling their victims to understand what job do they have, what companies do they interact with. And they send them messages that are personally relevant. And the first time that I saw something like this was really when people started discussing targeted attacks on the human rights organizations that were focusing on Tibet. And so one sample message that such companies received had a text of, attached here is the updated human rights report on Tibet issued by the Department of State of USA. Now the person who received this message, they were actually very interested in this stuff because they were in that business. And so they opened a PDF document that again looked like it was very relevant to them. This was their life. They were interested in this stuff. And, of course, it was a malicious PDF that exploited an unpatched vulnerability that got the system infected. So how do attackers know what business you're in, what people you interact with? I mean, a lot of sources. LinkedIn is one that comes to mind. It's amazing. You look at who the person's connections are, what companies he interacts with, who has vouched for him, who has recommended him. Twitter is the same way. You can see what the person's social network is, and you can craft the message to appear like it comes from the companies and people that he knows, and that it carries the content. And how do we tell our users? Don't open attachments from people you don't know. It's not a very useful advice anymore, because the messages that come to them are from people that they're likely to know. So, impractical. We've got to figure out something better to tell our users. Another way in which the message can seem very personally relevant is if it's associated with some legitimate company. So attackers oftentimes lend an element of credibility to their messaging by associating themselves with some legitimate way of interacting with people. So here's one example that I saw, this was published by Symantec. This was one of the many fake antivirus sites that you come across nowadays, and people are starting to get a bit cautious of downloading this antivirus tool that I've never heard of. So you know what, let me click a button to chat with them. So this was a site distributing fake antivirus tools, but they actually allowed their victims to chat with a real person about the problems that they're experiencing. And that really legitimized this transaction, and it also made it very personally relevant, because if you read the transcript of the chat session, this is the attacker behind the scenes interacting with the victim and actually trying to solve their specific problem. And what is his problem? His computer is probably infected, or at least so they've been told. And so here's this person interacting with the person who's a likely victim and making sure that he feels the love, he feels the attention of this company. And now the victim's guard is low, because he wouldn't think that the attackers would invest into real-world customer service like this. They've got to be a legitimate company. And so he does install their software, which turns out to be fake. So that was very interesting. And in this case, their chat was an online chat. And I actually have not seen situations where the customer support from a fake company would be voice-based. But nowadays, it's not very expensive to do either. So those were examples of making the message personally relevant, and that is a way of lowering our guard. Another set of attacks that I have seen, I've grouped under the context of social compliance. And by this I mean people have a natural tendency, I think, to do what other people around them do. You know, if you're in the theater and there's silence at the end of the performance, and then somebody starts to clap, everybody else starts to clap as well. And we don't do so without even thinking too much about it, because we do what people around us do. That's how we get along with people. We try to fit in. So let's look at some examples where this principle of social compliance has played a role. One situation is where malicious software was faking a review of a legitimate site. So you could place this in several different categories, because this is a way of legitimizing this fake antivirus tool. But I think of this as social compliance because an attacker, so here's what happened. The victim got infected with something. And that malicious software modified the victim's hosts file to redirect the common computer review sites, so that whenever you go, in this case, to PC Magazine's website, instead you would arrive at the attacker's website. Why would you go there? Because this malicious software that you installed is telling you that you need to install this program that's going to solve all of your problems. The program is called Antivirus 2010, and it's really good, but you've never heard of it. So what do? You browse to PC Magazine's website, and guess what? You find a review on it that says that this is a fantastic product. And in fact, reader rating is very high, 5 out of 5s. And you think to yourself, well, how bad can it be? I mean, other people found it useful. This legitimate website is reviewing it. But of course, what you don't realize is that malware has redirected your connection, and you're interacting with the attacker's website looking at a fake product review. So an element of social engineering that's more likely to have this victim pay money to buy this fake antivirus tool. Here's another example. And again, we've been hearing about social networking all the time, and that's because social networking, I think, is a platform that's going to thrive from our tendency to be socially compliant. And this is an example of the kube-faced worm, but there are many others like it. And whether you use LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter, what a lot of people do is when they see something that they like, they share it with others. And when others see something that others like, they want to share it with others, because we are social human beings. We want to. That's one of the many ways in which we fit into society, by sharing things that we like with each other. So what happened here? Well, in this case, the worm infected the victim's system, stole his session cookies to authenticate to Facebook and Twitter, and posted as the victim onto the social networking platforms. And the postings were links to sites that were distributing this worm. And people following this guy on Facebook or on Twitter, they presumably were curious in what their friend recommends. If their friend recommends it, they're probably going to like it as well, and they clicked on those links. And those links said, hey, there's this amazing video, you got to check it out. Well, if my friend likes the video, I'm probably going to like it as well, so I'm going to click. And when I click, I probably need to install a video player. So that's kube-faced. Here's another example, and this was an example that I thought the first time I saw clickjacking in the real world. This was distributed on Facebook, and if you were infected with this particular malware, it would use your Facebook account to share with your friends links to this fantastic site. The site was Want to See Something Hot. And if you went to that site, this is the image that you saw, except that I cropped it a little bit because there was more exciting thing happening on this end of the slide. But the thing is, if you wanted to see more, you got to click the button. And of course, people, whenever presented with a red button, people are always going to click on it. That's just in our human nature, especially if it's nice and juicy like this. But what you didn't realize is that actually there was an invisible iframe hovering over this button, and when you thought you were clicking on the button, you were actually clicking on a link to share the URL to the site. And so there was there was a social engineering aspect to this attack, because it relied on the victims seeing an interesting site in the stream of their friends and wanting to see what their friends saw. But also there was this interesting technological aspect of how they implemented this clickjacking by this invisible floating iframe. Here's another example of social engineering using the principle of social compliance, and this is a variant of the Nugachi worm. And this particular worm, the way it tried to social engineer people into downloading its executable was to manipulate counters of several sites that were distributing software, legitimate sites. I don't actually know which specific sites they were targeting, but sites like, I don't know, download.com. You know, there are plenty of people who just like installing software. And what these people do, and a long time ago I was one of those people, but I have since then gave up that addiction. But what a lot of those people would do is they would go to one of these sites and they would see, hey, what are people downloading nowadays? What's popular? I like playing with software. I want to see what's hot nowadays. And you know what, AVG, I haven't played with it. Maybe I'm going to download it because it's very popular. So what the Nugachi worm did is it actually a copy of the worm was uploaded to one of these file sharing sites, and then the worm kept hitting the download to artificially inflate the counter so that the popularity of this malicious file would float to the top. And so it would appear on the top as one of the most popular downloads. And you know what? If other people like it and download it, I want to see what they're downloading, and I'm probably going to download it as well. And so people who did that got infected. I think this is an element of social compliance, because we want to see what other people around us are seeing, we want to experience what other people around us are experiencing. And then another way in which this principle of social compliance comes into play is where attackers make themselves look very legitimate. Because if we see people who look like what the professionals are supposed to look, then we're more likely to trust them. And in this case, this was a scam that tried to recruit money mules, so that there are people who say that who are victimized into really laundering money for others. But these people think that they're working for a legitimate company. Why do they think so? Because they come across a site like this that looks very legitimate. It looks like they seem to advertise some express service, who knows what they do, but if you read it, it starts making sense. And if you are looking for a job and you want to make a quick buck and you have been unemployed for a few months, well, maybe you're going to interact with this website and you're going to send them your resume, and guess what? Yeah, sure, you're going to qualify because you've got their prerequisites of being willing to engage in certain activities. But a lot of these victims, they're really social engineered into doing this, many of them, I think, because the sites with whom they interact and the companies look really legitimate. So that's the principle of social compliance. If you look at the other types of scams that have been popular, I think we can group them under this heading of reliance on security mechanisms. And let me show you what I mean. There's the scam that's actually not an internet scam that I think is really brilliant. And this scam occurs in the real world. And in this case, the scam artist or the social engineer comes into the business. Let's say it's a bar or it's a deli or some kind of store, and he's dressed like a policeman. And he tells the sales clerk that there have been a lot of counterfeit bills that have been spread around. So he gives them for free a pen, which is a counterfeit bill detection pen. Have you ever seen people in supermarkets use them? It looks like a highlighter. And the idea is that you highlight a bill that you're suspicious about, and if the ink turns green, that means it's a legitimate bill. So what these people did is they went to the sales clerks and they just gave them highlighters, green highlighters. But they told them that it's a counterfeit bill detection pen, and so the clerk thanked them. There was an element of authority to the person because he looked like a policeman. And so later on, the scammer's accomplice would come into the same store and give the sales clerk some suspicious-looking bills. I mean, they were fake bills. But the thing is, the sales clerk thought, aha, these look a little suspicious. Let me try my marker on them. And the marker would swipe and it would turn green. So that means that it's a safe bill to accept. So that's how a lot of these people were able to pass around really badly made counterfeit bills, because the sales clerk had trust in the security mechanism that they were given. So I think that's a very interesting principle that you will agree a lot of our users are becoming accustomed to. And perhaps the worst offender in this, and I'm not going to show an example of this because we're probably sick of seeing these phishing scams, is the lock icon. Every phishing site that has been well put together has a little lock icon. It could be just an image of a lock, but our users are so reliant on this lock security mechanism that if they see a lock, well, that means it's secure. So that's just one of the early examples of this principle in action. But here's some more examples. These are security update mechanisms. And security update, what does that mean? Well, our users know that our vendors are looking out for us. And that's why every few months they distribute security updates to their products. And in my mind, the worst offender is probably Flash, because the security update built into Flash introduces a very dangerous workflow into the transaction of the user with a suspicious site. Because when do a lot of users get messages that it's time to update their Flash player? When they view content of a website that says that their Flash player is not up to date. So when they go to a site that they want to see, they get an error message saying, yes, we know you want to read this really exciting content that's personally relevant, but you got to download the latest version of the Flash player. The victim has no way of knowing if they're downloading a legitimate tool or not, and in many cases they're not. But the thing is, our victims have been subjected to these messages over and over again, so they're so used to this pseudo-security mechanism of the Flash upgrade that at this point, an attacker can use it against them, and the victim thinks that they're improving their security, but in reality they're being social engineered into installing malicious software. I think it goes to the root cause of us becoming overly reliant on the security mechanisms that are meant to protect us. A similar example of this is the fake antivirus tools that we've all been reading about. Why do these fake antivirus tools work so well? Because a lot of the targets are really scared of being infected. And a lot of these victims don't recognize the difference between a fake AV tool and a real one, because how can you? They look so professionally made. I looked at one site that provided graphic design services. It was a legitimate graphic design company, and they were actually advertising the various GUIs that they built for antivirus companies. But when I looked at the images that these companies were showing in their portfolio, they were all fake antivirus tools. But these vendors are paying legitimate design companies to make their interface look really professional. So anyway, here's an example of, wait a second. Here's an example of what a victim might see when they browse to a website that is trying to social engineer them into installing a fake antivirus tool. What they see are several security mechanisms, several security-related messages. These, in many cases, are just JPEGs, images that look like the victim's computer. Because everybody's running Windows, pretty much, and so everybody's interface looks pretty much the same. So a website can create a picture that really closely resembles the picture of the victim's computer. And therefore, they can draw little boxes that look like they're coming from the computer, and a lot of the naive victims won't know the difference. And of course, these are the messages that say, hey, watch out, I'm your antivirus program, and I'm telling you you're infected. You got to download this latest update to disinfect yourself. A popular way that we have all seen, but I think the reason it works is because we're becoming reliant on these security mechanisms. Another example that I recently came across is malware that's spread through spam, and if you wanted to, and the way you got infected is if you just downloaded and installed this malicious executable. And a lot of people are going to be cautious about this. So what the attacker did was they actually placed it on one of the popular file sharing sites. In this case, it was Hotfile. And what they did is they made it hard for the victim to download the executable. It's actually the same principle that I think is at work in fraternity pledging. If they make it really hard for you to become a part of the fraternity, then you're probably going to be really ingrained in their mantra. In this case, the attacker made it really hard for the victim to download the malicious executable. First of all, they had to wait 60 seconds for the download. That's just what the service does. If you're not buying their subscription, you have to wait 60 seconds to download. So now the victim clicked, and now they're thinking, well, do I really want this or not? But they have been waiting. They have some vested interest now. They're less likely to go away because they've been waiting. And then once they finished waiting, they get another mechanism, another wall that they have to go through. And this is actually kind of a security mechanism. It's a CAPTCHA. And a lot of victims are used to seeing CAPTCHAs because they don't quite understand it in many cases, but they think it's something security related. It's meant to protect them against the bad spammer guys. So there's a CAPTCHA, and if they type it correctly, well then they finally get their reward, their executable. And because they've been waiting and they've been going through some obstacles, well, they're probably going to download and install it. So this is another example. In this case, the security mechanism is this CAPTCHA that's meant to protect our users. It's actually working against us. So let's see. I think the last example that I have is scammers associating themselves with well-known brands because they trust these brands at being willing to protect the victims. And in this case, the brand that's meant to protect the victim is Google. Because I'm sure everybody has heard about all the effort that Google is putting into validating and scanning a lot of the sites that appear in their index. So this was a fake pharma site, right? One of those sites that tell you that here's a cheap way to get Viagra, because apparently it's really cheap in Canada. Well, what you see when you go to the site is that it looks like it's a Google-approved pharmacy directory. I've never heard of Google-approved pharmacy directory. I don't think it's legal. But a lot of the victims see this, and they think that Google is a trusted brand. Well, this is Google-approved, so it must be legitimate. And so they're social engineered into going there and starting to interact with these malicious and fraudulent sites. So what does all this mean to you and to us? Well, as we've all known that social engineering is successful, and what I try to do is to give you very specific, concrete examples that really happened so that we can talk to our IT departments and to our users and show them that it really works. It really works, and I think it works because social engineering techniques tap into the psychological factors that make us human beings, that operate in a society where we don't personally know every company and every individual. So I think we can use this for security awareness training. And security awareness training has a really bad reputation now. I think it was Marcus Raynham who said that if security awareness training would have worked, it would have worked by now. But maybe we're just going at it the wrong way. Maybe security awareness training is always just too boring and too easy to dismiss as being theoretical and not applicable to the individual. So that's why I'm trying to assemble these real-world scenarios that we can talk about with our victims as part of the social engineering training program. And that's why I wanted to mention these 4 factors that I have seen in action. There are a lot of ways of dissecting this. Several people might look at the same set of events and try to categorize them differently, but here's the way I can make sense of all of these attacks that have been happening. I wanted to talk about the alternative ways in which attackers can interact with us to lower our guard. I wanted to make sure that you knew that how people make messages personally relevant to the victims, how they take advantage of us wanting to be socially compliant and do things that our friends do, and lastly, how our victims are a bit too reliant on security mechanisms, and that's often used against them. So I think we can assume that social engineering will work. And what I wonder is, can we actually train our victims in the ways of social engineering? Will that really decrease the likelihood of them getting scammed? So far, it doesn't look promising, but maybe we haven't been going at it the right way. So those of you who actually perform security awareness training within organizations, I wonder if you can create an effective and engaging program that teaches about things like that, and then measure through pen testing whether or not it's been successful. I wonder, is this successful or not? I think it can be successful. So far we've been failing at it. So let's assume that we're going to fail, and that the outsider can very easily become the insider. What does that mean to us? Well, I think that means that when we look at our security architecture, we need to start thinking less about external barriers, if they're going to fail anyway, and start focusing a bit more on what goes on inside the organization, because an outsider can easily become the insider. And that means putting more focus on internal segmentation of resources and internal monitoring of traffic that goes on within and outside of your environment, or rather outbound traffic, and focusing on giving your users as little privileges as they need, not because you don't trust them, but because you know they can easily be scammed and you're trying to protect them. So that's probably what I want you to leave this session with, thinking about an outsider in a similar way as the insider, and re-architecting your environment accordingly. And yeah, the concrete examples that I showed you. If you want these slides, I'm not sure if you're going to get them as part of the conference. Probably you will, but if you want a copy, send me an email. I'm happy to share these stories with you. And everything that I've been discussing has been based on publicly available information. So I have the URLs to all of this to show that this really happened. It's not just us theorizing about what could have happened in the environment. So any questions about this, or any observations? Have you seen other techniques that I maybe should have mentioned that have been really effective in the real rather than theoretical scenarios? Yes?
I just had an observation that criminals and pen testers put a lot of thought into social engineering. Maybe we should try that with our user education instead of death by PowerPoint.
Yeah, so you're saying criminals and attackers put a lot of effort into social engineering because it works. So put more effort into training your people to deal with such attacks. Because yes, if they have been taught to expect certain things, that they can second guess things, and also make it okay for them to ask for help. Because in many cases, people feel embarrassed that they have seen this, that they fell victim to this. But if we tell them that it's okay, everybody falls victim to this, tell us as soon as this starts happening to you, we can help you catch it early on. Yes?
One question I would ask is, what percentage of users do you need to be effectively following cybersecurity awareness training for it to be considered effective? If you look at people that still aren't buckling their seatbelts, it just seems to me that it is hopeless, and that if you're using cybersecurity awareness training, what you need to do is companies like Wombat, and I'm not associated with them, and others, that are doing the fake social engineering, the fake phishing attacks, so that you can measure the effectiveness of your cybersecurity awareness training You can hold employees accountable for not following the kinds of things they're supposed to do. You can increase your training for particular groups. I mean, to me, that's an essential part.
Yeah, so what Andy is emphasizing is the fact that you can really put some metrics behind security awareness training and how effective or ineffective it is. Because you can have an engaging social engineering training session and then hire somebody or do it internally to have your users social engineered by a pen tester and see if this is effective. Was their success rate less or more than than before the training, right? And at the same time, see if it's effective. And if it's not effective, you know what? Maybe this is bound to fail, and then create your security architecture accordingly.
Let me add one other thing for folks that I think the best example manifested by government, that government is beginning to be convinced that cybersecurity awareness training is a failure, is the National Strategy on Secure Online Transactions. That pending initiative, the National Strategy on Secure Online Transactions, is trying to raise the bar on the processes and the technology that are used so that you don't need so much cybersecurity awareness training.
Yeah, because assume that social engineering will succeed. Some users might be trained, some just don't care or are untrainable, and yeah, don't put too much of your trust into the user. Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway. Yes.
You're talking about corporate users. I mean, all the gazillions of people who are kids, who are just home computer users, who live in other countries, who live in developing economies, every one of those is an attack vector.
Yeah, I think Patrick is bringing up the fact that the scope that we need to look at goes beyond just the corporate enterprise, but also the people with whom employees interact at home and their kids and who knows what they're installing on the computers. Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge problem. That's why, again, I agree with Andy. Try this, see if it works. Maybe it will, but don't trust in it working. Invest in repeatable, technological, measurable controls that can really protect information without trusting the user too much. Well, I think we're running out of time. Thank you very much for your attention. If you could please take a few extra seconds to give some feedback to me and to the organizers about this session, that would be most appreciated. And I'm also going to be around if you have any thoughts or questions. So thank you, guys.